Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the April Office of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer Grand Rounds. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would like to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives who are present in our meeting today. I'm coming from the Turrbal and Yagara lands down in Brisbane. My name is Una Shoemaker and I'm the Director of Nursing within the Professional Capability Team in the Office of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer. Today, we are hosting a presentation from Professor Roianne West from the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives. Before I introduce Professor West, though, could I please ask that unless you're presenting, you keep yourselves on mute. We can mute you from where we are presenting today. If you would like to ask questions, we'd like you to put those into the chat if you wouldn't mind. And if we have time at the end of the address, then we can look at those questions then. Professor Roianne West is a Kalkadoon and Jakunde descendant and is the Chief Executive Officer of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, which is otherwise known as Katsunam. Katsunam is a national peak Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander controlled community representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives nationally. She is an Aboriginal healthcare professional with over 26 years of experience in delivering quality healthcare to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities, building inclusive societies and contributing to the betterment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Professor West is an active researcher providing an evidence-based framework for developing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workforce through targeted nursing and midwifery training. She engages all communities in highlighting issues impacting on Indigenous populations and has a long-term focus on influencing policy making and providing sustainable solutions to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to achieve important career pathways. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Roianne West. Thank you, Roianne.
Lovely. Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to present on our new cultural safety and cultural humility training. As Anna said, my name is Roianne. My people are the Kalkadoon people from Northwest Queensland, where the Northwest HHS now resides. Always hold a special place in my heart for Queensland Health as the state's first nursing director with a dedicated portfolio of Aboriginal health and the state's very first professor in a joint position between the Townsville Hospital and Health Service and Griffith University School of Nursing and Midwifery. I also sit as part of the Queensland Nursing and Midwifery Executive Council, so I like to keep abreast of some of the issues within nursing and midwifery, and particular cultural safety in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health contexts. So in preparation for my presentation today, I've sent through to the CNMO office the 2 attachments as well as a short video which will help actually takes you through the Mullumbimangari platform, and they will be available for anyone across Queensland Health, not just who's attending today, and I do encourage you to take the time to have a look at those resources as well. Today, I'm going to take you through a short presentation on the key aspects of Mullumbimangari, and then I've allowed some time at the end to be able to respond to any questions or comments directly. Next slide, please. So I'll begin by acknowledging the Katsunam founding members. So for those of you who aren't aware, Katsunam was founded 25 years ago this year. So I'm very fortunate to have come into the organisation heading into its quarter-of-century anniversary. So I've been the CEO of the organisation for only 18 months now. And the picture that you're seeing on the screen are our founding members who gathered on Gadigal country 25 years ago in Sydney. The main reason that our founding members gathered was because of the concern of the low Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing numbers across Australia, and the need to have a voice for Aboriginal nurses to have a voice for improving health outcomes for the communities from which these nurses come from. At the time in which Katsunam was founded in 1997, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses unfortunately only occupied 0.5% of Australia's nursing workforce. Here we are in 2022, and the latest data tells us that Indigenous nurses and midwives occupy only 1.27% of Australia's nursing and midwifery workforce. So although 25 years provides a fantastic opportunity to celebrate our achievements, and we've been doing that across multiple campaigns, and Mullumbimby is one of those. It also provides us with the opportunity to reflect on our impact, and given that we've only had less than 1% growth in Indigenous nurses across a 25 period, it presents an opportunity for us to be able to develop strategies to ensure that that trajectory changes dramatically as we move forward as nursing leaders. Next slide, please, Reading. So this is an interesting question that I wanted to pose, and more a rhetorical question, just because we're online, it's a bit more difficult to respond, is the difference between what cultural safety is and also cultural humility. There's also a lot of confusion about what cultural safety means across the board. So for anyone who comes from, has a different set of values, beliefs or worldviews, as opposed to what cultural safety actually means in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health contexts. And in the context of today's presentation is what cultural safety means in the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, specifically within nursing and midwifery. So when Dr. Ramsden, Irihapiti Ramsden, was a Māori nurse who conceptualised cultural safety as an educational paradigm in the early 1980s, so it's a gift to nursing in the world, and it's a gift to nursing in Australia because it was conceptualised by a Māori nurse in nursing education. Since then, cultural safety has taken many tosses and turns across this 30-year journey from the early 1980s. And Mullumbimby is really about going back to the roots of what cultural safety meant for nursing and midwifery in particular. And I look forward to sharing some of the learnings in Mullumbimby that I hope encourages you to eventually enrol within this program. The next aspect that hasn't been spoken about in cultural safety as much, and there's many iterations of cultural safety, is the concept of cultural humility. And that's a concept that's unique. The integrating of cultural safety and the need for cultural humility in achieving culturally safe nursing and midwifery practice are critical and concepts that are unique to the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives. Thanks, Reid. So to begin, I wanted to introduce you to Aunty Matilda House, who's a traditional owner of the Ngambri Ngunnawal people in the area where the Canberra region now resides. The reason why I'm introducing you to Aunty Matilda House is to provide an explanation of what the name Mullumbimby actually means. The reason why we've chosen the traditional owners from the Canberra region is because Katsunam is a national peak body, and our head office at the time in which I became the CEO was actually on Ngambri Ngunnawal country. If you could press play, Reading, please.
Reid, and you'll need to go off mute so that we can hear. Oh dear. Let's take it back and we'll try again. I'd just ask everyone to be patient. This is Reid's first ever job.
Can I tell you that when you're sharing a YouTube video, at the top of the share screen is a little share computer audio. It looks like a screen with a cross through it. That needs to be clicked so the audio of the YouTube will play.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. You only learn that when you've actually made this mistake yourself. I know that feature because I've done this exact same thing, Reading. So when you're ready, Dylan.
And I can't be in there to support Reading because I'm a close contact. So she's in the office and I'm at home. That's not helping either. We'll have another go. We actually had a practice run this morning and it worked, so I'm not sure.
Oh, good. Maybe that's coming in now, Anna.
Can you hear the sound?
It doesn't come in the first couple of seconds. It's a bit deceiving, but about 10 seconds in, you hear Annie Matilda start talking. So if you want to just press play, then reading, it should be right. Good. Anna, do you want to go to plan B? I'm happy to make both of these videos available and I'll move through to the slides.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Roianne.
That's all right. That's fine. So, Reading, just while you're going back to the PowerPoint slide, I'm onto the slide that's got the top title that says Design for Practicing Nurses and Midwives. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll talk to 5 key principles around Mullumbimulngurri and why it is unique. Is that it has been specifically designed for practicing nurses and midwives. So for the 20 years that I've been working in cultural awareness, cultural safety and education for nurses and midwives, most of the training that I've been doing has been within the higher education sector in undergraduate nursing and midwifery programs. This program has been specifically designed for industry as a continuing professional development innovation, which means that this is the first time that we've used Patricia Benner's competency framework to be able to demonstrate that the training has been developed for nurses and midwives that actually have some experience to be able to hang their learning on, which is very different to undergraduate nurses and midwives. So when people say, what's the difference of this program to other cultural safety training innovations, that it is very much targeting practicing nurses and midwives. And in particular, the reenactment that occurs in Module 3, I'll talk a little bit more about the reenactment, but it's a reenactment that occurs in an acute care setting on an acute ward that involves a team leader, an Aboriginal registered nurse, an Aboriginal patient, and then the nurse that's been allocated to care for that patient. So there's a suite of innovations across the country and in particular within Queensland Health with the Cultural Capability Framework. We know that some HHSs, a majority of HHSs, have a policy that stipulates mandatory cultural safety training or cultural capability training. And again, it's called different things across each of the HHSs. And this is usually done on induction or orientation into a HHS. And then there's, I think it's got 3 to 5 years of relevance before you have to then do be able to do a refresher. Unfortunately, doing 4 to 6 hours of cultural awareness training isn't sufficient education to be able to prepare a nursing and midwifery workforce to work with what is the most vulnerable population within Queensland's health system at this point in time. So this training in no way replaces or substitutes the current cultural safety, cultural awareness or cultural capability training. It does, however, provide further opportunities to facilitate lifelong learning. So you don't just do your mandatory induction training and then tick you're culturally safe and walk away. Mullumbimulngurri provides a nursing and midwifery specific training that is only current for 2 years, and then you'll be expected to come back and do a refresher. And we're in conversations with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia on how we actually embed cultural safety training in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health into actual regulation to ensure and support nurses learning in this area. So important Mullumbimulngurri. So I'm an academic by trade. Working within Katsunam is my first time outside of an academic setting and outside of Queensland Health. It's informed by research and also key literature. And the main piece of literature was going back to Dr. Irahapati Ramsden's thesis and reading it again and again and again to ensure that we were honouring the original intention of Ramsden's work. So again, just to reiterate that Dr. Ramsden was a nursing educator and the concept of cultural safety was conceptualised within nursing education within New Zealand and based around the experiences of Māori people and the impact of colonisation on the Māori people. Dr. Roianne come up with the concept of cultural safety when she held what Māori people call was a hui. And in the hui, they were talking about clinical safety, and it was a gathering of Māori nursing students. And they were talking about clinical safety, my apologies. And one of the Māori students said, what about cultural safety? So Dr. Ramsden sought that student's permission to use the language of cultural safety. And the concept was about increasing Māori nurses because they know that they needed Māori nurses to be able to care for Māori people. So if you look at cultural safety, and that's the reason why we need to go back to the original origins of cultural safety, and in particular for nursing, we've got a greater responsibility than other professions because it was a gift that was given to us by our Māori nursing colleagues in New Zealand. It extends the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery health curriculum framework. So if you're not familiar, a mandatory inclusion of a discrete course on Aboriginal health and cultural safety has been mandatory for undergraduate nursing education for well over a decade. Prior to 2015, even though there was a regulatory standard that stipulated the inclusion of this course, unfortunately, there was no guidance for nursing and midwifery academics as to what would go into that course. It was only in 2015 that the Commonwealth Government endorsed what was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Curriculum Framework. And then in 2018, Katsunam led out with the contextualisation of that broader health curriculum framework to develop the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nursing and Midwifery Health Curriculum Framework. And that curriculum framework is currently under review. And the curriculum framework, the Mullumbullingarri training, has been designed and developed in accordance with that nursing and midwifery curriculum framework. When I finished at Griffith University, I brought a couple of team members with me across to Katsunam that are expertise in online learning. And the course has rigorous curriculum, adheres to rigorous curriculum design principles, and in accordance with the 8 general standards for quality matters higher education rubric, and in particular learning and teaching online. It adheres and presents principles of Aboriginal knowledges and Aboriginal pedagogies, which is Aboriginal ways of learning, Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing within the Mullumbullingarri training as well. Thanks, Reeden. So the program structure is quite simple. When you come into the program, you come into the welcome section. It has 3 modules. The first is the foundation module, understanding cultural safety and cultural humility. Module 2 talks specifically about cultural safety in nursing and midwifery in Australia. It talks about the journey of cultural safety from New Zealand, and in 2001, when it was accepted into Australia by the then CEO of the Katsunam, Dr. Sally Gould. And then it goes on to support you to apply your learnings from Module 1 and Module 2 into Module 3, which is the reenactments that you are presented with. So the Mullumbullingarri program, again, to give you an example, in the university, a Bachelor of Nursing and a Bachelor of Midwifery are at an AQF level 6, and Mullumbullingarri is at been designed and developed at a graduate certificate level, so an AQF level 7. And we've mapped against the Australian Quality Learning Framework to ensure that it stayed at that level, hence the reason why it's for practising nurses and midwives. And if your students attempted to do Mullumbullingarri, they could do it, but I would say that they would grapple with some of the concepts if they didn't have the experience to be able to do it. It's like getting someone to do a graduate certificate in nursing leadership if they haven't done undergraduate or don't have the experience or done, training to be able to start learning at that level. Thanks, Reeden. So what makes Mullumbullingarri a program distinct? It uses a lot of models because I'm a very visual person. On the left-hand side, what you can see here is cultural safety occurring in levels. So the first is cultural awareness, is understanding that there is a difference between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Second is cultural sensitivity, and that's actually demonstrating sensitivity towards those differences. And cultural safety is actually understanding those differences and then changing your nursing practice to be able to accommodate what those differences are. And cultural humility is about exactly that, is about acknowledging what you don't know, which can be sometimes very difficult. So whilst cultural safety has existed in Australia for many years, it hasn't been defined for developed as a model for training and education. And there's a real mix-up between cultural safety and education and cultural safety and practice. And Ramsden's work, very much a decade of work, very much consolidated, conceptualised, trialled and tested cultural safety as a nursing education paradigm. Unfortunately, in Australia, as of yet, we haven't done that. We have not done cultural safety in nursing and midwifery practice as well as it has been done in nursing and midwifery education. So just to pick up a paradigm and then drop it into another context, that's the reason why there's so much vulnerability within cultural safety within nursing and midwifery practice. And the reason why there's probably more questions than answers to what this cultural safety thing means within nursing and midwifery in Australia today. So Katsunam's Mullumbimangari is the first of its program nationally and probably internationally to actually define what cultural safety means and what Mullumbimangari means. And our model is very much informed, and we specifically chose Patricia Benner because most nurses in this country know who Patricia Benner is, and most nurses are familiar with the framework of Patricia Benner in regards to the competency levels across your years of experience. So what we're hoping that Mullumbimangari starts to do is to get nurses to start to think where they sit using Patricia Benner's framework in regards to cultural safety, whether they're a novice, an advanced beginner, competent, proficient or expert. So when I say expert, as an Aboriginal woman who's been a nurse for 25 years, a professor of nursing and Aboriginal health, I'm not an expert. That the complexity and diversity within Aboriginal health means that I have to exercise cultural humility even as an Aboriginal nurse, because it constantly changes and I'm constantly learning. And when I move into a different country or when I move into a different role, I go all the way back to novice and I work my way through that level. So this isn't linear. The learning in cultural safety is circular. And as you move in between caring from people that come from different communities and different backgrounds, your nursing and your learning also has to change. And that's where the cultural humility aspect comes into it. So even when I had a nursing academic colleague, he said, you know, Roianne, I've worked in this area for 20 years and I thought I got it. And I said, that tells me that you don't get it, because if you think you got it, that means you don't get it because you never get it. And I know that sounds like it's going around, but you don't ever actually get it. You might get it for a bit, but then because of the complexity, it will change. And again, that's the cultural humility aspect there. So the rationale being to address latter stages of nurse and midwifery careers and to contextualise this into Australian context. So other health professionals may do this training, but nursing and midwifery language, terminology and roles is very much central to this training. This is something that us as nurses and midwives is very much about nursing and midwifery. And it goes to Dr. Ramsden's work of reforming two systems. She talked about reforming two systems. One was the health system, which we're all very familiar with, but the other one, she said, was reforming the system of nursing and midwifery. And that's what Mullumbimangari does. It gets nursing and midwifery to start to look inwards, because until we transform nursing and midwifery, we will grapple to transform Australia's healthcare system to improve health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it really takes a step back and gets us to look at nursing and midwifery in this country in order to be able to look outwards with Australia's healthcare system. Now, I'm just going to pause to see whether we're going to try and get this video going. Reading, do you want to give it another go, Don? Or let's give it one go, and if we don't get it, we'll move on.
I think we've got a workaround. We think we have a workaround, so we'll see how we go with Auntie Dolphin.
Okay.
Okay.
Wish me luck.
Just bear with us for a minute.
I think I'm. That working?
Yep, no, it comes now, I think.
Dulcie Flower. I'm of Torres Strait descent. My family has originated from Darnley Island in the Torres Strait. The island name for that is Arab. I think it's most important to ensure that that nurses practice cultural safety, And it's not in what they do, it's how they do. The role of Katsunam is really to look after the needs, professional needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait nurses and patients. Thank you very much for making the decision to undertake this training. Keep an open mind. You gain skills that will last you a lifetime. You will make a difference to the patients, to the way you nurse patients, and ensure that their culture is also respected and that your own culture is respected. Sonika.
Thanks, Breeden. Well done.
Thank you, Trina. And thank you, Roianne, for your patience.
Back over to the slide. Well, the reason why we present to you Aunty Matilda, one as a traditional owner, again, is acknowledgement of country. So we're demonstrating cultural protocol throughout Mullumbimangari in very subtle ways, and Aboriginal knowledges like using our elders. So Aunty Dulcie Flower was the first Torres Strait Islander nurse for Australia's first Aboriginal medical service in the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service, and Dr. Sally Gould, who was the founder of Katsunam, was the first Aboriginal registered nurse within the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern. What I'm particularly proud about with Mullumbimangari is that prior to Mullumbimangari, all of the training and education for nursing and midwifery that I've done across most of my career has had the non-Aboriginal nurse and midwife as central to the design. And in Mullumbimangari, I had this epiphany when I became a grandmother recently that what we are trying to teach non-Aboriginal nurses and midwives and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery workforce actually comes with. So in our attempt to improve cultural safety for non-Aboriginal nurses and midwives, we've inadvertently excluded privileging the uniqueness of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery workforce. And irrespective of how dynamic I am as a nursing educator, that what we do within Mullumbimangari or any of the education that I've done, you can't teach what an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery workforce comes with. So Mullumbimangari is the very first training program that I've done that actually starts to privilege the unique role and the knowledges of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery workforce. So throughout the program, you'll get cameos from like Aunty Dulcie Flower. You'll also meet Dr. Carmen Parra, who is a founding member and a contributor to the In Our Own Right Black Australian Nursing Stories, who are talking about their experiences of being an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander nurse in Australia. Next slide, please. This is the exciting bit, I think. So what I'm showing you here is our 4 actors. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we were unable to do an actual reenactment on the ward. So what you get in Module 3 is introduced to 4 characters. By the time, so Mullumbimangari Delivery 1 has just ceased. So Mullumbimangari Delivery 2 will come in July, and there will be a 5th actor who's the actual patient. So you can see from the practice-based scenarios, you'll meet Brenda, who is the Aboriginal registered nurse who's on the ward. And Brenda's actually on the other side of the ward. On one side of the ward is Michael, and Michael is looking after an Aboriginal woman and asks to undertake an abdo assessment. And the scenario unpacks or includes prompts to get you to unpack what are some of the cultural considerations that you as a practicing nurse need to take into consideration, and what are the leadership responsibilities from like Amber, who is the clinical nurse team leader on the ward at that point. So the actual practice-based scenario that we've used is from the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia Code of Conduct. So when the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia launched the new Code of Conduct in 2018, it was the very first time that Code of Conduct identified racism and white privilege in the Code of Conduct. So with all of the codes that were developed in the Code of Conduct, each of them come with the case-based scenarios for nurses and midwives to look at to see potentially how they could be working to or potentially breaching that particular code in their practice consciously or unconsciously. So we've worked with NMBA and taken that scenario and brought it to life, and then inserted in particular cues to support learners within Mullumbimby to apply the learning from Module 1 and Module 2 into Module 3. Brenda is an Aboriginal nurse that's working on the other side of the ward. And one of the things that often comes up as an Aboriginal nurse, and I know that I've been told this and I still hear this, is that we have non-Indigenous nursing colleagues that tell us to leave our culture at the door, leave our Aboriginality at the door. And that's very difficult to do, and probably like asking us to ask non-Indigenous female nurses to leave their femaleness at the door. It's just not possible. And when we're wanting to increase Indigenous nurses and midwives, we want to increase them not purely because it's based on equity. We have to do better at demonstrating our reason to increase Indigenous nurses and midwives is because of the cultural knowledge that they actually bring. So the cultural knowledge that we're attempting to start to raise your awareness with in Mullumbimby, an Aboriginal nurse or midwife predominantly comes with. So as well as building the cultural safety of the non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce, you have to also build the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery workforce, and not one at the detriment of another. So what this case-based scenario Module 3 actually brings is Michael is looking after the patient, Amber's the clinical nurse team leader that's doing her business, and Marilyn is the carer for Brenda. For the patient, and Brenda's on the other side. And the scenario provides a prompt because some Aboriginal nurses might get offended if their colleagues don't ask for them for support around how to care for an Aboriginal person if it's complex care or any other care. Whereas some Aboriginal nurses might not want you to go to them for everything Aboriginal. So Mullumbimby does not provide answers to any of these questions. What it does is provide prompts to start the conversations with your colleagues about how to do this. Because one of the reasons we are losing Indigenous nurses and midwives in the country is because we're not valuing the Indigenous knowledge that they bring as a gift to nursing and midwifery in this country. And Mullumbimby is the first training program that starts to unpack what that means for nurses and midwives in this country. So I'm very proud of that aspect. And like I said, by the time you guys enroll, and I'm hoping that you enroll, that you will actually have the patient that's in this scenario as well. So again, just to reiterate, it's in an acute care setting. You've got a nurse unit manager, so we tried to sort of doctor up a sort of generic scenario, and Michael has to carry out an abdo assessment on a female Aboriginal patient. And then it allows you to unpack all of the different things that might come up. So Mullumbimby doesn't give you the tick to say you're now a culturally safe practicing nurse or midwife. All it does is give you some scenarios to allow you to start to unpack and have these really important conversations with your colleagues. Thanks, Reid. Next slide. So I talked to this previously, and everyone that's attending today will know what the infamous RN practice standards are. So you can see that we've got 7 standards, and when you look at cultural safety, that it currently sits in standard number 3.1. What this model is demonstrating, cultural safety and cultural humility has to be embedded across all of these practice standards, and it's not something that you can isolate or do in isolation. So it's just a visual representation of how cultural safety needs to embed itself within the way that you practice, and that you don't just practice in a particular way with one patient, that whatever the skills that you learn to work with an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander patient will only strengthen your ability as a registered nurse or midwife. Thanks, Reid. So what I'm presenting here, and some of the work that we've been doing, because we've been doing cultural safety training in Australia for 50 years. So cultural safety training started very much in the early 1980s, and although Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't using the language of cultural safety, our old people were definitely teaching about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people way back in the early 1980s, and again the concept was introduced to Australia in the early 2000s. So what you can actually see here is what we're calling a genealogy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery. And what I'm presenting to you is an example of some of the materials that are in Mullumbimby. Why this is important for us to know, and history is important for us to know, is that in nursing and midwifery, we've been doing this for 5 decades. yet we're still getting care that's not safe. And we know that the care isn't safe by the continued overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across all aspects, all social indicators, but particularly within our healthcare sector, and more significantly within cardiac, renal, and some of those more complex diseases. So what Mullumbimby does, it steps you through this genealogy. You can either read the transcript or you can hear my voice again, which you're going to get sick of hearing throughout Mullumbimby. Sorry, it was COVID and we had no one else who was going to take the job. So you're going to hear me. I'll become your bestie. You'll know me more by voice than by face. And I step you through the genealogy as a nurse to say, this is what we've done. This is what we've done really well. And this is what we need to be doing better. And I use a lot of the we because this isn't an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery issue. This is a nursing and midwifery issue. And we as nursing and midwifery leaders at the 25-year celebration of Katsunam need to be doing something dramatically different to what we've done historically in order to get a different outcome. And the genealogy presents a sustained collective impact of the sorts of things that we've been doing across 25 years, but it also presents us with an opportunity to reflect on how we want to do things differently. A piece of work that Katsunam has been involved in is the National Safety and Quality Health Standards. So all of the health services that are regulated by these standards, there's Katsunam actually designed and developed cultural safety standards for the 400 assessors of these standards. So we're not only working at individual nursing and midwifery practice level and the regulation standards for NMBA, but we're also working with the standards that have been identified in the NSQHS, because there needs to be a multi-pronged approach of individual cultural safety, organisational cultural safety, health system cultural safety, and nursing and midwifery cultural safety as it relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health as well. Thanks, Reid. Next slide, please. So just starting to wrap up, guys, each of the modules has a digital badge. So you'll get a digital badge for module 1, module 2 and module 3. And the digital badges have got a chip in the background. So this can be uploaded to your LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever that might be. And on completion of Mullumbimby, you actually get a certificate of completion. And the digital badge and the certificate of completion has 2 years of currency only, at which point will then expire until you do refresher training. Excitingly for me, because it's my research program, is that we not only have an evaluation program that's pre and post, but I've been leading a research program for 8 years that's been measuring the impact and efficacy of cultural safety training. And this tool has been deployed around Mullumbimby so that we not only get people that are saying that they had a really positive experience or a negative experience, but we've got a scientifically validated tool that at the end of this, that we can analyse and produce whether this training impacted on people's learning across it. So it's the very first time that we're bringing a research agenda to this type of training, and we're excited about that. We have been deploying and validating this tool across 7 years, and we've got about 3,000 completed pre and post survey tools that the data that we're using is helping to guide the way in which we design and develop education innovations. Prior to my role at Katsunam, I worked across a faculty that had 26 undergraduate professions. So the opportunity to be able to come back to nursing and midwifery and consolidate our work within this space in order to be able to then potentially scale up to work across the workforce eventually. But in my learnings, nursing and midwifery are by far better positioned, and I'm not biased because I'm a nurse. I think the regulation that we have through NMBA and APRA, and also the work that Katsunam's been doing with the peak bodies, means that nursing and midwifery is the best positioned of any of Australia's health workforce to be able to consolidate work within this area. Thanks, Reid. So this is some of the feedback that we got. So we run a pilot before we went live with Mullumbimby on Close the Gap Week in March. So we selected nursing educators from both industry and across the university. You can see we're being open, we're sharing a variety of the feedback that's come back. We also had the policy team from the Commonwealth Chief Nursing and Midwifery Office, and we had some of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer jurisdictionals, and we had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses that helped to design the case study as well. So they're practicing directors of nursing in rural and remote settings that help to actually ensure the authenticness of this training as well. One of the most significant findings is that people saying this is the criticism this was not what we had done before. And for us, that's not a criticism, because we needed something that wasn't done before. We've been doing things in a particular way for a particular amount of time and getting very minimal impact. This training, you will not walk away with knowing. You will actually probably walk away knowing less, because that's the point of the training, is that Ramsden wanted people to pull up and reflect so that they don't continue to work unconsciously with with Māori people, and in our context with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is that encourages you to work consciously. So if you do embark and enrol on this program, it's not a program that you're going to be able to put one day aside and do the 8 hours, because there's been pedagogical hooks that have been embedded in this training that will make you stop, read a question, reread a question, write it down, and then read it again. Our job is done, because you've had to stop and reflect and apply a particular learning. So that it definitely is not like anything that you've done before. So if you've got any preconceived ideas about this type of training, or you've done it at uni, or you've done it in the health service, you need to completely get rid of them all, or you'll be rudely shocked about what Mullumalangari is, because it's very different in that respect. And these are some of the comments. So we had the full spectrum from this is life-changing, everyone should do it, to it wasn't what we expected. And certainly there's no education innovations in this country where you get 100% of nurses and midwives that think it's the greatest program they've ever undertaken. So we didn't expect that. But even the criticisms that we got about Mullumalangari, for us, were good criticisms. It was good criticisms. It took too long to do. We highly recommend, and the reason why once you enroll, you get 8 weeks to complete, because we recommend 1 hour per week. 1 hour, do it, reflect, consolidate, process, have a conversation, and then come back. You will not be able to sit down and be able to do this all at once. So thanks, Reading. So where do you get more information? Anna and the team have disseminated some documents that I hope are relatively easy to read, and I've included here, and I think in the email, Anna, just remind me, we've got the Katsunam Mullumalangari website that has further information, and there's also a Mullumalangari email. So if there's anything that we haven't answered in those questions, please send us an email, and we really look forward to getting as many nurses. And I do have to preface this with, I would say that this training, in particular Module 3, is more about nursing. And I would say going forward, Module 2 will be the module that we will pull out and hopefully have a suite of case studies, in particular one that might be in the birth suite, one that might be in aged care, one that might be in ARCHO sector. But this one very much, I would say, is more about registered nurses in an acute care setting than another setting that there is. So I've done well. My aim was to get to 12:40 and then allow 20 minutes for comments and questions. So I'm now going, Anna, are you happy to facilitate any questions?
I certainly will, Roianne. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really informative. I'm going to open it up first to Ruby. Ruby has 2 questions. Ruby, are you comfortable to ask them of Professor West?
Yes, no worries. Thank you very much, one, for doing this presentation and putting this program together. It sounds very comprehensive, and I look forward to participating in this program. My questions are really around how are we embedding these, I guess, this knowledge and this content, like this understanding amongst the other disciplines within health, because it's not just nursing and midwifery. Nurses and midwives deliver the care, they deliver the prescription of care that is, you know, I guess, ordered and prescribed by medical treating teams. And then we work with our allied health professionals as well to help, I guess, sustain health outcomes for our patients. So I'm just wondering how we're reaching this knowledge to those areas in health as well.
Medication one was the one I was thinking that was contact. Yes, you're right. Is that everything working together? Yeah.
Roianne, we seem to have you on mute, but you don't appear to be on mute. Do you want to just try again? Everyone, just to let you know, Roianne seems to have dropped out. She's just rung me. She's going to, Ruby, she will answer your question. She's just going to come out and come back in.
Yep, no problem.
Ruby, we might have to put you on silent. So if everyone can just bear with us for a minute and Roianne will call back in. The joys of technology. Are you there, Roianne?
We go to Ruby's question, Anna.
Yes, please.
Hi, Ruby. I didn't drop out because I didn't want to answer your question. It's a very important question, and I should also, I need to acknowledge that at the same time Katsunam is leading this training, that our colleagues, so the Indigenous Australian, Allied Health Australia, Indigenous Allied Health Australia under Donna Murray also leads out on cultural safety training, as well as the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association under Monica McCabe-Barrelitz is also leading cultural safety training. So all of the 4 Indigenous health peaks do have their own cultural safety initiative. So the work is actually being done, Ruby, I suppose is the answer to that question.
Ruby also has a question about refresher training.
Yes.
Yes, so with the refresher training, is it the same duration as the initial course, or is it a modified refresher with updates of any, I guess, considerations that may have changed, any processes, and particularly in regards to the National Quality and Healthcare Standards, because we know that they get reviewed and updated quite regularly.
Yep.
So yeah, how do we capture that?
Good question, and I'd love to be able to give you an answer, Ruby. The challenge is we've only just finished writing Mulungari. We knew that it needed to have a expiration date on it, but we haven't quite moved into what the refresher training may look like. But it will certainly align with, you know, with NMBA. All of our conversations are with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia, and while we're doing Mulungari, we're also working with the NMBA around reviewing the practice standards as well as the codes of conduct, because Mulungari at the moment leads ahead of where those standards and codes are, and even the program accreditation standards for nursing. So we've got a little bit of work to do to try and get all of the elements actually aligned so that they're not inadvertently undermining what is a really important piece of work. Nice background, Ruby.
Thank you.
I'm just going to check, Tarita, did your question get answered at the same time as Ruby? So Tarita asked, can this training be offered to other disciplines? And I feel like you've answered that.
Did. Yeah, I didn't see Ruby's question, but I'm pleased.
Yeah. And it's not that I don't think that the other disciplines are really important. I guess I know where my expertise is, and my expertise is in nursing education, and certainly all of the research that we have done. So in most universities, there's always a discrete Aboriginal health course that is taught right across the profession. So it services the whole of the faculty. Unfortunately, it is so generic in trying to service the whole of all of these professions that it loses its impact, because adult learning principles don't quite apply when there's an embedded bias in the way that you think and learn. So developing discipline-specific education innovations means that you have to teach in a different way. And it means that when we develop Mulungari, is that we're actually working with the philosophy of nursing and midwifery and the values that underpin nursing and midwifery that will influence the way in which you think and then eventually work. So it's not that I'm adverse to the other professions, is that the innovativeness of this training is that it is very specific to nursing and midwifery history and philosophy, values and practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Roianne. Joanne, you have a question?
You're on mute, Joe.
Yama, sorry, yeah, it's, you know, if only there was the one button that you could just press for both at times in these sort of segments. So mine is just more of a question in regards to is the cost when it comes down to, is there a limit to the number of students for, because it's when you go in, it just has the one price. Is there a limit to the number of students? So if we was something I was going to roll out across, say, our Department of Medicine in nursing, yeah, so.
No, definitely not, Joe. So Katsunam, our core business, as a membership-based organisation, we don't have a learning management system, but the platform upon which Mullumbimby sits is a Melbourne-based company, and they do a lot of health education across the country. I'm told it can cater up to 100,000 people at once, can be in Mullumbimby. That makes me very nervous, but that's their core business. At the moment, what the price that we've got is for an individual enrolment, and we're in conversations with what they call business to business. And we've got some businesses that want upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 registrations per year for a number of years. So we have really identified where there's a chasm, where there's a massive gap in quality cultural safety training for nursing and midwifery. So absolutely absolutely not. It can take up to however many. And the reason why we're doing a rolling enrolment is because we want to run a quality process, pull up, analyse the evaluations, analyse the results from the research program, you know, do the quality check to make sure the links are up to date, address any concerns, and then we go back out and deploy again.
Thank you, Roy. It'll be lovely. Maybe we can do it as gifts as well for International Nurses Week as little prizes that we give them a free subscription to it.
That's a good idea, Joe. I'm keynoting at your CNMO conference. I'd be happy to award a Mullumbimby gift.
That'd be great. Thank you, Roy.
Roianne, that's amazing. Thank you. And you're on record, just so you know. Roianne, I hope you don't mind. I can't see any other hands up, but or there might be one. But I have a question myself, because I was a bit, I suppose, disappointed that you talked about Aboriginal nurses having to leave their Aboriginality at the door. So I wanted to know, and this might show my ignorance, but does the training also address cultural safety and cultural humility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses working in a largely white workforce?
I wouldn't say that it starts to, but because it's only an 8-hour training program, no, it doesn't go to the depth that it does. And I don't know whether I give the impression that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses are exempt from this learning, because they absolutely are not. And I learnt more as an Aboriginal nurse, and I also learnt about the biases that I held from being educated in a Western, primary, secondary, and very highly educated university sector, that there are entrenched biases that I myself exhibited, that meant that I at times practiced in a culturally unsafe way. And that's probably a good example of cultural humility, is that I was naive in thinking that me as an Aboriginal nurse meant that I practice in a culturally safe way, when you don't, because you work within a system that works against you working in a culturally safe way. So we are not exempt from this learning at all. But what I do hope is when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses undertake this training, and the best comment I got when Aboriginal nurses undertook this training is that I saw myself, is they have never undertaken any training like this where they saw themselves. And I was adamant that this training would speak to the unique role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives.
Thank you. I'm just going to open it up. If anybody else has a question, could you put up your hand? We've got just a few minutes left.
Anna, I can see one question up there. So Ruby was asking, are we encouraging boards and executives to undertake this training? And Ruby, my response to that question is absolutely. All of them, but this is again within nursing and midwifery. All of the National Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia are undertaking this training, and all of the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council. So when you talk about boards and executives, I know you're probably referring to boards and executives of a respective HHS, but definitely for us, as a national peak body, our responsibility is the boards and executives of nursing and midwifery. In order to bring them along in the journey, they absolutely are undertaking this training.
Thank you for that, Roianne. All right then. So thank you very much, Professor West, for your engaging presentation. You've highlighted the Mulungari Cultural Safety and Cultural Humility Education, which is targeted at practicing nurses and midwives rather than undergraduate nurses and midwives. I would really encourage people who've been online today to talk to your colleagues about the availability of this training and for you to consider undertaking it. I've put the link in the chat, but when all of the information's up online, it will all be placed there for you to be able to see it. I'd also like to congratulate Katsunam on 25 years of success and progress, although, as Roianne highlighted, the movement forward is slow. Karen's just posted in line, thank you for the brilliant session. She's going to pass along information to the dialysis nurses in Cairns, and we really hope that word of mouth will continue. Roianne's just let you know that she's our keynote speaker at the Passionate About Practice Symposium, which is being held on the 6th of May between the International Day of the Midwife and International Nurses Day. It's being held by Teams, hopefully we'll get our act together by then, and face-to-face in Brisbane at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital on the 6th of May. And invitations have gone out to all Queensland health nurses and midwives. I'd really strongly encourage you to consider attending or enrolling for online. It's free. In terms of our forums, our next forum is the Nurse Unit Manager and Midwifery Unit Manager Forum on the 3rd of May at 12 midday, and that's being hosted by Metro South, who are going to talk about mentoring and succession management, handover to and from relievers, and also building a research culture. Our next grand rounds will be held on the 18th of May, and our next Enrolled Nurse Forum will be held on the 8th of June. We have an educator forum which is held 4 times a year, and I'll send the links in case our colleagues in education couldn't get on, because I think this will be very valuable to them as well. So again, Roianne, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing how people get on with finding Mulungari training. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. And we'll send the documents on.
Lovely. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody. And I just want to acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives that joined in today, and just congratulate you on all the work that you do for our communities. And I hope that you also find Mulungari, that you see yourselves in this training as well. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.